Okay, Baruch Hashem, we are back in Sichot HaRan, and we are continuing with this very novel and very challenging Sicha of the Rabbi. And we began this Sicha a week or two ago, actually, and we were describing the danger of philosophy and wisdom, which is disconnected, disassociated from spirituality. And now Rabbi Nachman says something that's very challenging for me. And I prayed to Hashem a lot to be able to say it to you, honest to the text, like Rabbi Nachman says, and not to try to shift it because of my own inner queasiness. But, I just being open and honest, something that I've struggled with since starting to become Bal Tshuva, is the concept of onesh, punishment or consequence. I'm sure a lot of it comes from misorientations that I have with it based on growing up, hearing about Christianity, learning about Christianity, also growing up secular and Ashkenazi, and so it just was not a part of my life at all. This concept of punishment or the concept of negative consequence from your actions even, which is probably why I was such a mess as a kid and why it took me so long to grow up. But nonetheless, there is such a thing as consequence for actions. And therefore, Rabbi Nachman's going to say something now. And it's important to know. And Bezrat Hashem, together, as friends, students of Rabbi Nachman, we can hopefully work it out. So he said like this. The Rebbe said that one who knows nothing of such books like philosophy and secular wisdom, but he walks a simple path and he fears the consequences of Hashem. He's fortunate. And he says, Mefurish explicitly, the only way to begin to serve Hashem is through fear of negative consequences. Without that, Rabbi Nachman says, it's impossible to take the first step. He said, even the tzaddikim, they must have this level of fear, since very few can devote themselves to Hashem merely because they love Him so deeply. The main thing is to have yirat ha'onesh, to have fear of negative consequences from negative spiritual actions. Now, this is not to say that this should be the ikar, that this should be consuming you at every moment. It's not that this is the level that you should be shooting for. It's just that Rabbi Nachman is saying that the beginning of true service of Hashem starts with being conscientious of the fact that your actions are meaningful. And therefore, just like your positive actions have positive consequences, negative actions also have negative consequences. And this is the beginning of really serving Hashem. Now, Kabbalistically, the reason this is so is because there's 10 sfirot. These 10 sfirot are revelations of godliness. These are the avenues, these are the channels in which Hashem connects to us, because Hashem's infinite and we're finite. So how does infinite and finite collapse into a relationship? The answer is through these sfirot, through these emanations, through these channels. So it's explained in Kabbalah that the way to Hashem, you have to start with the lowest sphera and go all the way up. What's the lowest sphera? What's the lowest emanation of godliness? It's called Malchut. Malchut, we usually describe it as emunah, as faith. Sometimes it's also described as bitul, nullification of ego. But it also is described as yira, and not an elevated yira, meaning the type of yira that is not, I'm worried or I'm concerned about negative consequences, but that I have such awe, I have such appreciation for the greatness of something that I keep myself at a distance as a result of that. It's not because of my concern about doing something that's destructive. It's only about, I'm in such awe of this thing, I have such reverence for this thing, I wouldn't want to do anything else, okay? Now that's a much higher level and that's another sphera. But this lowest sphera, which is Yira of Malchut, is Yirat HaOnesh. So therefore, a person might say to themselves, like me, what about those years that I served Hashem only from love? Because it was so foreign to me to have a worry or a fear of consequence. So now Rabbi Nachman says that the only way to begin to serve Hashem in truth is by having that awareness and that responsibility, and to understand that positive actions have positive consequences and the opposite. So that means that even though those first years were necessary for me, and that was my starting point, but it doesn't mean I was truly serving Hashem. Because the only way to really serve Hashem is to have both sides, is to have awe and to have love. And the beginning of all of that is to understand that your actions have consequences, and not to want to make decisions that are poor for myself or for those around me because of the consequences that's going to come as a result. Rabbi Nachman says one can also serve Hashem out of awe because he's unbelievable, because you love him so much, because of how much he's done for you, because you realize how incredible it is that he is not only the creator of the universe, that he's recreating the world at every single moment, that he's drawing life force into everything at every moment. And if he didn't for one tiny sha'ah, one tiny moment, it wouldn't continue to exist. This can put you into a state of tremendous awe. And this is a higher level of fear. This is a higher level of yira. But he says it's also very difficult to attain. The reason why is because as opposed to malchut, which is the lowest sphera, this is yirat ha'onesh, that's fear of negative consequences. This higher level of yira, not fear, but awe. The place that the Zohar says that when you have this level of yira, this level of awe, you have true inner peace. That comes from the sphere of bina. So this is the other typically female sphera. But the difference between bina and malchut is the difference of one end of existence to the other. Because bina is above the natural world. Bina is the 8th sphere from the bottom. So you have 7 in between malchut to bina. So to be able to get to the point that you have true yira, ilah, as it would say in Aramaic in the Zohar, this higher fear, this level of awe, that it's not that I don't want to make a mistake because I understand that my actions have consequences, but I wouldn't even begin to contemplate to do so simply because I'm in such awe of the thing that I'm in front of. Like, just as a basic example, let's say, for instance, I'm a drug user, okay? And I smoke marijuana all the time. So now let's say, for instance, I have an authority figure, let's say my dad or my mom or something like that, or a teacher. I wouldn't smoke in front of them, right? Because I'm worried about the consequences. I know my parents would be very disappointed in me. I know my teacher might suspend me. So that's going to get me to stop doing it in front of them, or in a way that they're going to know about it. And it works because I'm never going to do it in front of them. And I'm never going to do it in front of my teacher. But what is a higher level? A higher level is I have such reverence for my parents. I love them so much. I appreciate how much they have and continue to do for me, that I would never want to do it because they don't want me to. And they don't feel like it's good for me. And because of my appreciation for them and knowing that they know more than me, then I wouldn't do it for that reason. And that's a much higher level. That's a more intimate level. That's more personal. And it's a more genuine level of avodat Hashem. But that only comes later. That's something that needs to be worked towards. That's something that Rabbi Nachman says every day you need to extend your days in order to be able to get to that level through learning and through praying and through hipo to do it and through so many different means. And it takes a lifetime to maybe get to a place like that, in truth. But it starts with, I don't want to do it in front of them because I don't want the negative consequences. When a person becomes involved in philosophy, his mind becomes filled with doubts and questions. These reinforce the negativity that's already inherent in man in potential. That is his nature to be drawn to physicality as separated from spirituality. Because we know that in truth, nothing is wrong with the physical world. And the Shita, the perspective of the Torah, is not to disconnect you from the physical world, it's to enhance the physical world. Because in other religions, they don't see how spirituality and physicality actually connect. So the way in which they encourage that you become more spiritual is by separating yourself from physicality. But the whole ikr and the whole chap of Chassidut is not to run away from physicality or not to feel ashamed of physicality, but actually to be completely connected to the physical world by enhancing it and enlivening it through godliness. So, simple example, it's not about not eating. Maybe that's a level, meaning that's that, like, in order that I should stop overeating, I'm gonna try fasting today, right? But ultimately, what's the goal? The goal is to be able to eat with kedusha, that I eat and not more than I need to, that I eat in order to serve Hashem, that I eat actually at a higher level to be able to experience that the pleasure in this food is pure godliness. And the food is only the container for that, and to meditate on that, right? So that is taking the food itself, physicality, and my pleasure that comes from it, and I'm uplifting it. In the language of psychology and the language of the Baal Shem Tov, I'm sublimating it. I'm sublimating my eating so that it's not only an act of physicality, which is not separate or different or distinct at all from animals, but I'm actually taking that same act and I'm elevating it. That is much higher, according to the Torah, than not eating. So same too here. When a person, Rabbi Nachman says, involves himself and learns secular wisdom, philosophy, things that are divorced or contradict the truth of the Torah, so Rabbi Nachman is saying a very deep thing takes place. That part of you that wants to be involved in the physical world for physical reasons only, to have sex because it feels good, to waste seed because it feels good, to eat food because it tastes good, to do something publicly because of the honor that's going to come from it. That part of us is strengthened when you learn philosophy. It's an unbelievable thing. Elsewhere, what's the reason? Because your desires for the physical world, they come from the lower sefirot, right? The lower sefirot are called emotional sefirot. Those are part of your spiritual being. But those emotional sefirot, they have to get their life force from what's called the mochin. That is your mental sefirot, your psychological sefirot. They draw life force down into your emotional sefirot. They're what give birth to it. Even though the emotional sefirot can lean in one way or the other, you can have a propensity towards positive or negative actions with your emotions and with your physical mises, your physical actions, but it's the life force that causes you to actually do so. What is the life force of your emotional well-being and your physical well-being? It comes from your mental well-being. And what is the mental well-being in the language of the Sfirot? It's Chokhmah and Bina and Da'at. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Mochin, according to Kabbalah and the Arizal. So that means simply, whatever wisdom that I'm imbibing, whatever knowledge that I am cultivating, that I am internalizing, whether it's Torah, whether it's secular wisdom, whether it's philosophy, whether it's science, whether it's math, anything that I am meditating or cogitating on in my mind, that is the life force for my emotional and physical well-being. Because the mochin, these mental sefirot, are what channel down into the lower emotional and physical sefirot. Therefore, Rabbi Nachman is saying, when you are learning something which is divorced from spirituality, that means you're not going to be receiving from the Chokhmah Bina Da'at of godliness. You're going to be receiving from the Chokhmah Bina Da'at of the Sitra Achra, of the other side. And that life force is not going to bolster and empower your godly emotional self and your godly physical self. Instead, it's going to bolster and empower your emotional self which is your lower self, meaning the part of you which is emotionally turbulent and destructive, and the physical action, that part of yourself which disorients you, which creates negative consequences. So it all starts with the mind. It all starts with what is the information, what is the knowledge that you are receiving, that you're imbibing. I say this all the time, but it's very powerful. Rabbi Nachman says that a Jew needs to guard his mind me'od, very much. And Rabbi Nachman says that he's not being poetic. He doesn't use extra words or extra letters. And he doesn't use that you should do something me'od all the time, very much. But he says when it comes to guarding your mind, you need to do so very much. The world teaches us, not even explicitly, it's completely implicit. You never hear it from anybody. Nobody told you to do this, but it's so built into our system from Western civilization, from secular life, from 2021. That is that your mind is hefker. That's what is taught to you implicitly. What does hefker mean? Ownerless. So, as an example, that means that my mind is not something that I have to protect, that I have to guard. It's not like a treasure that I'm going to make sure that nobody takes it from me. It's not a treasure that I have to make sure I'm always holding on to it and I never tarnish it. It's just an unlimited space that can experience anything and it doesn't change me. That's what's implicitly taught to us by society. So if, for instance, I watch pornography, that's not going to affect my well-being. Right? Just because I'm thinking about it or seeing it, how is that going to change? That doesn't change me. I just have an experience with it. Or let's say, for instance, I'm going to watch a sports game. And all of a sudden, certain things are popping up during the game. Even the sports game itself, right? What is sports? It's all about me asserting my will against another. It's based on competition. It's based on domination of physicality. And you don't realize how much that's affecting you. Because we think that our minds are like these unlimited, untouchable realities. And it's so not the case. And this is what Rabbi Nachman is teaching us, and it's so important. Your mind is very sensitive. Your mind is very precious. Your mind is the life force for your emotional well-being and your physical well-being. It's what gives birth to your positive emotions and your positive actions. And therefore, if you're drawing wisdom from the secular world, then you're drawing life force from the Sitra Achra. And that then gives birth to your emotions, which come from the Sitra Achra, like depression, like anger, like ego. And it also gives birth to negative actions, like hurting people, like hurting yourself, like doing things that are dangerous and have negative spiritual consequences or negative relationship consequences, negative physical consequences. And all of that is drawn from your consciousness. It's drawn from your moach. And he says the only way to stop yourself from drawing in the mochin of the other side, from drawing in the consciousness of philosophy or secular wisdom, is through fear of negative consequences of doing so. That's the beginning of it. It's not getting to the point initially that I love Hashem so much, that I'm so much in awe of him, that I'm so much in awe of his Torah, I'm so much in awe of his true tzaddikim, that when Rabbi Nachman says it's a sore, you're not allowed to touch it your whole life because of the negative consequences that come from it, that we have such reverence for him that we don't want to. In the beginning, it's not like that, Rabbi Nachman says. In the beginning, you just have to be scared. You just have to be worried about what's going to happen to your emotional and physical state afterwards. And then ultimately get to the point through learning and through davening and through connecting and through simcha and through joy and through love, that you're doing it just because you have such reverence, just because you have such respect, because you have such tremendous recognition of Hashem in your life. Only then he can actually begin to serve Hashem. But philosophy raises doubts and questions, and the safek, the doubt itself, is what strengthens your lower self. Right? We know that Amalek is the eternal enemy of the Jewish people. We think that means that it's like a physical enemy. But the essence of the Torah is the spiritual guide. It's not a history book. That means Amalek is constantly trying to trip you up. He's constantly trying to throw you down. An enemy is not someone who's like, kind of busy with you and thinking about you from time to time. An enemy is someone who's thinking all the time about how to knock you out. So who's that? That's Amalek. So the Baal Shem Tov says, what is that in my life? So he says the gematria of Amalek is safek, doubts. So that means that your enemy is your doubts of spirituality, your doubts of yourself, your doubts of the Torah, your doubts of tzaddikim. Where do all those doubts come from? They don't come from yourself, because the nature of a Jewish neshama is he believes. We're called believers and sons of believers and daughters of believers. You naturally believe. So why is it so hard for me to believe? The answer is doubts. Now, where does Amalek come from? Where do those doubts come from? So Rabbi Nachman says it comes from wisdom that is divorced from spirituality. That's where it comes from. And once those doubts creep in, that's when your emotional self goes into turbulence. That's when your physical self goes into turbulence. This is why he says we never find a person who became a chassid, that he became someone who has yirat shamayim, he has awe and recognition of Hashem in his life through the study of philosophy. He says nobody ever did that. That through that study of Aristotle and Socrates, he says, you know what? I have yirat shamayim. He says it never happened in history. And although such works do contain discussion of good and the like, he's not saying that in philosophy there's nothing good there. He's not saying that in secular wisdom there's nothing good there. He says there is good there. However, he says that in the end, for a Jew, it ends up being destructive for him because of the propensity of negativity that's within there. And because the person's not holding in a place that it doesn't affect him in a negative way, because of how intense the doubts that come from that place is. You know, I have a friend who, after he became Baal Tshuva, he went to yeshiva. And he was like on fire. He was learning and he was davening and he was connecting and he was ready to live a whole new life with Hashem, to get married, to have children, and to, you know, try and help other Jewish people, and to go get a job, and to try to be a kiddush Hashem to people. And as soon as he got out of yeshiva and he's like ready to do this whole new life, he went to like Barnes and Nobles or something, and he saw some type of like book in the philosophy section. And he didn't know about Rabbi Nachman at the time. He didn't learn his teachings, no nothing. He just told me about it afterwards once we started learning Rabbi Nachman's teachings together. And I told him Rabbi Nachman's whole perspective on secular wisdom. And he opened up a book on philosophy or something. And he said that his whole inner world went into like a spiral, like a tornado. That even though he had spent 2 years building up like this tremendous faith and sense of security about who he is and where he wants to be, he said literally it all went to nothing. It just completely twisted and turned to the extent that as soon as he was done, he's like, does God really exist? Does it really mean anything that I'm Jewish? Is this just cultural? Is this just happenstance? Like, even though he had spent all this time working on it, Rabbi Nachman says that's the danger of these things. Because it's not that the arguments are so great that it's throwing you into that place. It's that is the moach, that is the consciousness of the Sitra Achra. And that has the power to throw you off completely in every way. Rabbi Nachman then says, and as a result, they add up to nothing. One loses much more than he gains, as the end result is great confusion. He says, this severe prohibition against studying works like this have been noted elsewhere, but Rabbi Nachman was very makpid on this. The Rebbe often told us how fortunate we were that Moshe Rabbeinu showed us the right way, right? Moshe, the one who gave us the Torah. Rabbi Nachman says Moshe began the Torah without any philosophical proof. With the simple words, in the beginning, Hashem created the spiritual and physical universe, right? It's very interesting. You never think about it. Why does the Torah start this way? You would think that Hashem knew thousands of years in advance we would make technological advancements, enlightenment movement, industrial revolution, and the list goes on and on. That at this time, all we care about, all we value is evidence. Evidence-based practice, as we'd say in psychology and social work. We need evidence. So the Torah should just start with proofs. Rabbi Nachman says it's bedavka. It's specifically not started that way. Moshe did that on purpose. Hashem did that on purpose. Why? He directed us to believe in Hashem through Amuna Pashuta alone. Because the gateway, the beginning of connection to Hashem does not come from proofs. It comes from faith. Although the Zohar Kodesh, he says, it belittles this concept of fear of negative consequences spiritually, right? The Zohar says that this is a very low level. Speaks about it in many different places, that the goal is Yirat Shamayim at the highest level. Yir Ilah, that is awe of Hashem, that comes from love, that comes from wisdom, that comes from like real good connectedness and das. But Rabbi Nachman says all the books of Musar still write that this is the main gateway to real devotion. I think we're going to finish the Sicha next week. Bezrat Hashem. Does anybody have any questions from today's class?
No questions, Rob. Good class.
Thank you. Thank you, Leroy.
Rabbi, great class. Thank you.
Thank you, sure. I appreciate that. Any other, any questions, any statements, any comments, anythings?
Rabbi, you'd be happy to know that this week I was in a grocery store on my lunch break, and I walked down the book aisle, and I picked up the book, and it looked interesting. I had to walk, purchased it, and I remembered, Rabbi Nachman's, teaching on secular wisdom up immediately, and I went and put the book back down and said, "The local say HaRan is all we."
Wow. Chazak Baruch. Chazak Baruch. Beautiful, Leroy. Proud of you. Okay, amazing. Everyone should have strength. We're starting a new Sefer Torah. We're starting Shemot, exile, redemption, Geula. It starts with the Moshe Rabbeinu. It starts with the Tzaddik. It starts with the Torah. Bezrat Hashem, we should all be strengthened and be able to listen to the advice of people that know more than us, even if we don't understand. And eventually, Bezrat Hashem, through this, we'll come to very, very deep understanding. Everybody, amazing day.
Amen.